Changing of the Guard, a short Dvar Torah for Parashat Bo. This week I'd like to address two famous theological questions that accompany the beginning of Sefer Shemot. The first, why was Moshe raised in Paro's palace? Surely Hashem could have arranged history so that he grew up comfortably in his parents' home. And second, why did Hashem bring 10 plagues upon Egypt? Why not just take Bnei Israel out immediately? I am, of course, not the first to ask these questions, and many commentators have answered them in various ways. I do, however, want to examine them through another biblical story, seemingly unrelated at first glance, the story of Shmuel's consecration as a prophet, and thanks to Professor Rabbi Yoshua Berman for the lesson that provided the basis for the comparison. If you liked anything, feel free to give him credit. If there were any parts you didn't like, it's probably my innovations. Let's begin with a summary. Shmuel serves in the sanctuary where Eli's sons, who are called Bnei Belial, conduct the priestly services. Hashem appears to Shmuel, who 3 times is sure it's Eli calling him, and goes to check if he needs something. Each time, Eli sends him back to lie down, and after the 3rd time tells him to say, "Speak Hashem, for your servant hears." Shmuel listens to his master's instructions, at least partially, and receives a harsh prophecy concerning Eli's household that has already been given in the previous chapter. In the morning, Shmuel opens the door to the Mishkan and avoids telling Eli, who calls him and asks him to tell him what Hashem said. Shmuel reluctantly answers, and Eli accepts the judgment upon himself. That concludes the summary. The summary itself raises several questions. Why did Hashem need to call Shmuel 3 times before the prophecy? Why repeat the prophecy? What is Eli's role in the story? To answer, we should examine the verses themselves. First, it's worthwhile emphasizing Shmuel's roles. Pasuk Aleph highlights Shmuel's title, a title that will be highlighted many times in chapter 1 and 2. Shmuel is a Na'ar. This is mentioned 5 times in the chapter of his birth, 4 distinct times in chapter 2. I don't want to get into the 3 other times, although I have a theory about them as well, and twice more in chapter 3. In fact, his being a Na'ar is so important that Shmuel is the only character in Tanakh of whom it says, Vehana'ar Na'ar. What is this Na'arut and why is it important? I can suggest 3 answers. A. It may refer to Shmuel's young age, and despite the old slogan, the world belongs to the young, in practice, it's run by the adults. Shmuel holds an inconsequential position. B. Most of the Na'arim I've identified in Tanakh were anonymous people. There are Na'arim like Moshe and Yoshua who rose to positions of greatness, but a quick search of the Bible shows that they are a minority, and even that minority is not always well known by name when called a Na'ar. Anonymous people are not influential. And C, the word Na'ar is often used interchangeably with servant. Shmuel is the servant of the Kohanim who leads a certain worldview. As a boy, he serves as their man. All these interpretations can explain what happens in our story, but I want to focus specifically on the 3rd. Eli represents an ideological worldview in the Mishkan. According to that worldview, Hashem is central to the service of the Mishkan, and man is secondary. One can see the ideology in several instances. Eli does not speak to people. He sits upon a seat by the doorpost of the Mishkan Hashem. When Hannah prays, he does not see a desperate woman, he sees someone desecrating the Mishkan. When he rebukes his sons, he uses an opposite argument for what we say today. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against Hashem, who will intercede for him? Commandments between man and God are much more important than those between man and his fellow man. When he hears about his nation and sons falling in battle, Eli will not react, but when he hears the ark was captured, he will fall off his chair backwards and die. Eli is not a bad man. He will bless people and call them my son several times, but his ideology, which is expressed in all its glory in his reaction to Shmuel's prophecy, is that Hashem is central. If there's no contradiction, then we can also relate to people. Hashem hu, hatov be'enav yaseh. Shmuel, meanwhile, comes from a family where people are central. Shmuel's father, Elkanah, is described repeatedly as a man, Ish. According to the sages, he's also the man of God who prophesies to Eli the prophecy of wrath at the end of chapter 2. One can see this manifest with Shmuel, who grew on and was in favor both with Hashem and also with men, with the fact that after the prophecy concerning Eli's house, he opens the door of Hashem's house, and with the summarizing verse of chapter 3, where all Israel from Dan Ve'ad Beersheva knew that Shmuel was established to be a prophet of Hashem. Shmuel represents the approach that will replace Eli and his household. But to replace the existing regime, one needs to receive its legitimacy. Without it, the replacement will always live in the shadow of the previous ruler, and the nation may think the change of power was unlawful. Shmuel, the youth who grew up in Eli's house, sees himself as his successor, Eli's, coming by virtue of Eli's power. When Shmuel hears Hashem, he's sure he hears Eli because Eli represents the voice of God. The repetition of the prophecy was not meant for Eli. If he could have, Shmuel would not have told him. It was meant to enable Shmuel to understand that despite coming through Eli's authority, there are things he has to change. Eli's role, meanwhile, is to grant Shmuel legitimacy by passing on the torch. And if we return to this week's Torah portion, the ruling empire when the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt is the Egyptian Empire, with its culture, values, and idol worshipping. Any attempt to replace the perceptions instilled by the Egyptians would rightly encounter suspicion and opposition unless they came from an internal source, like, just for argument's sake, someone raised in Paro's palace. And if that replacement were to receive the outgoing king's endorsement, then the children of Israel would be able to leave triumphantly, even if it required 10 plagues to get there. In blessed memory of my beloved and dear student Amichai Shimon, son of Batya, and Ishai Rubin, Hashem Yikam Damo, Dovi Holtz, one who loves Tanakh.